Today, we're going to delve into one of the darkest and most intriguing topics in history: serial killers with the highest number of deaths. Prepare to meet the 5 serial killers who terrorized the world with their brutal and shocking crimes. We will analyze their stories, their methods, and the impact they had on their victims and society. This video is an alert about the human mind and its obscure capabilities. By learning about these cases, we can better understand the mechanisms behind violence and psychopathy, seeking ways to prevent and combat these crimes. If you like investigative content and true crime, don't miss this video. Subscribe to the channel to not miss the next episodes, and leave your like to strengthen our work. Javed Iqbal, one of the greatest serial killers in history. Javed Iqbal, 1956 to 2001, was a Pakistani serial killer who became infamous for his crimes against children and adolescents in Lahore, Pakistan, in the late 1990s. He is considered one of the serial killers with the highest number of victims in history because of the magnitude and systematic nature of his crimes. Number of victims. Victims confessed and recognized by the court: 100 boys. Possible victims. It is believed that the number is exactly 100, since Iqbal kept meticulous records and confessed to this specific number. There is no concrete evidence that he killed more or less than this number. Javed Iqbal is among the serial killers with the highest number of victims in the world for the following reasons. Confirmed number of victims. With 100 confirmed victims, he is among the serial killers with the most victims in modern history. Detailed confession. Iqbal confessed his crimes in detail, even sending letters to local authorities and newspapers describing his actions. Physical evidence. Substantial evidence was found, including photos of the victims, personal belongings, and even human remains dissolved in acid. Meticulous documentation. He kept detailed records of his victims, including photos, names, and personal belongings. The case. In December 1999, Iqbal sent a letter confessing that he had murdered 100 street boys, mostly between the ages of 6 and 16. In the letter, he explained in detail how he seduced the victims, drugged them, sexually abused them, and then strangled them. After the murders, he dissolved the bodies in acid to eliminate evidence. When the police investigated his apartment, they found albums with photos of the victims, clothes, shoes, and other personal belongings that Iqbal had kept as trophies. Acid, chains used to tie up the victims, and other evidence that corroborated his confession were also found. Trial and sentence. Javed Iqbal was tried and found guilty of all 100 murders. In March 2000, the court determined a symbolic sentence. He should be executed in the same way he killed his victims, strangled in front of the children's parents, his body cut into 100 pieces and dissolved in acid. However, before the sentence could be carried out, Iqbal was found dead in his cell in October 2001. The official cause of death was suicide, although there are theories that he may have been murdered in prison. The case of Javed Iqbal remains one of the most disturbing in criminal history, not only for the number of victims but for the calculating and systematic nature of his crimes, as well as the detailed documentation he kept himself. Miyuki Ishikawa. Miyuki Ishikawa was a Japanese midwife who became one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Her case is particularly notable not only for the high number of victims, but also for the social and economic context of post-war Japan that contributed to her crimes. Number of victims. Victims proven in court: approximately 40 babies, for which he was formally charged. Possible victims. It is estimated that the real number is between 103 and 169 babies, according to different investigations. Some sources suggest that the number could reach up to 500, but this is more speculative. Miyuki Ishikawa is among the serial killers with the highest number of victims in the world for the following reasons. Scale of the murders. Even considering only the confirmed victims, she is among the most prolific serial killers. Position of trust. As director of a maternity hospital in Tokyo, she used her professional position to commit the crimes. Organized system. She developed a systematic scheme of infanticide that included the participation of others, including her husband. Complex motivation. Her crimes involved both deliberate neglect and a system of extortion of poor parents, mixing financial motivation with a distorted view of mercy. The case. Between 1944 and 1948, during the period of economic hardship after World War II, Ishikawa worked as the head midwife at the Kotobuki Maternity Hospital in Tokyo. She began to let babies, mostly from poor families, die from deliberate neglect, claiming that she was sparing children from a life of poverty and suffering. Eventually, she and her husband developed a scheme where they contacted the parents of the dead babies and demanded payment to cover funeral expenses, arguing that it would be cheaper than raising the children. The scheme was discovered in 1948 when police found the remains of several abandoned babies. The investigation led to Ishikawa, and records of numerous babies born under her care who had disappeared were found in her home. Trial and sentence. Despite the magnitude of the crimes, Ishikawa's case reflected complex attitudes about infanticide and poverty in post-war Japan. She was convicted in 1948 but received a surprisingly light sentence, only 4 years in prison. Her husband received 2 years. During the trial, Ishikawa argued that the truly responsible parents were those who abandoned their children, and that she was only dealing with an inevitable social reality. She also argued that the government was partially responsible for not providing adequate assistance to impoverished families. The case of Miyuki Ishikawa led to changes in Japanese laws related to child welfare and adoption, with new policies implemented to protect vulnerable children. Her case remains one of the most disturbing examples of serial murder, particularly because it occurred in a medical context and was partially facilitated by the difficult social conditions of the period. What makes her case especially complex is that, unlike many serial killers who kill for personal gratification or pure psychopathology, Ishikawa's crimes occurred in a context of social and economic crisis, although this does not diminish the moral gravity of her actions. Pedro Alonso Lopez, the Monster of the Andes. Pedro Alonso Lopez is considered one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history, known by the nickname the Monster of the Andes. His crimes spanned 3 South American countries, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, during the 1970s and early 1980s. Number of victims. Victims proven in court. In 1980, he was convicted of 110 murders in Ecuador, although he was tried for a representative sample of cases. Possible victims. Lopez confessed to having murdered more than 300 girls in different countries, approximately 100 in Colombia, 100 in Ecuador, and 100 in Peru. Authorities consider this number plausible, based on the evidence and consistency of his confession, although the exact number is impossible to verify completely. Pedro Alonso Lopez is among the serial killers with the highest number of victims in the world for the following reasons. Large-scale confession. His confession of more than 300 murders, if true, places him among the most prolific serial killers in history. Partial verification. Authorities were able to substantially verify many of the confessed murders, finding bodies in locations indicated by Lopez. Transnational crimes. The fact that he operated in 3 different countries made the complete investigation difficult and may have allowed him to continue longer without being detected. Focus on vulnerable victims. He primarily targeted young girls from poor and indigenous communities, which means that many disappearances may not have been properly recorded or investigated. The case. Lopez had an extremely traumatic childhood, marked by sexual abuse and abandonment. At the age of 18, he was arrested for theft and suffered abuse in prison, which, according to him, intensified his hatred. After being released, he began his series of murders in Peru in the early 1970s, then moved to Colombia and eventually to Ecuador. In 1980, he was captured in Ecuador while trying to kidnap a girl. After his arrest, he led authorities to dozens of graves of his victims. The victims were predominantly girls between 8 and 12 years old from poor rural areas. Trial and subsequent fate. Lopez was convicted in Ecuador and sentenced to the maximum allowed by the country's law at the time, 16 years in prison. Surprisingly, he was released in 1994 for good behavior, after serving 14 years. He was deported to Colombia, where he was briefly admitted to a psychiatric hospital and then released in 1998. What makes the case even more disturbing is that Lopez's whereabouts are currently unknown. He is said to have disappeared, and some speculate that he may have continued killing, although there is no confirmation of this. Others believe he may have been killed in retaliation for his crimes. The case of Pedro Alonso Lopez highlights serious flaws in the criminal justice and mental health systems of South America at that time, as well as the vulnerability of marginalized communities. His story also raises disturbing questions about how societies deal with extremely dangerous criminals, especially when they cross national borders. The magnitude of his crimes, the vulnerability of his victims, and the fact that he may be at large make Pedro Alonso Lopez one of the most disturbing cases in the history of serial killers. Luis Garavito, the Beast. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos, known as La Bestia, the Beast, is considered one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Born in 1957 in Colombia, Garavito is responsible for a shocking number of child murders, mostly boys, during the 1990s. Number of victims. Victims proven in court, Garavito was convicted of 138 murders after confessing and helping authorities locate the remains of his victims. Possible victims. Garavito confessed to having murdered about 140 children, but investigators believe the real number could exceed 300 victims. Some reports suggest the number may reach 400, based on ongoing investigations and the pattern of disappearances in areas where he was present. Luis Garavito is among the serial killers with the highest number of victims in the world for the following reasons. Confirmed number of victims. With 138 convictions, he has one of the highest numbers of confirmed murders by a single individual. Geographic scope. His crimes were committed in at least 11 different departments, states, of Colombia, covering a vast geographic area. Systematic method. He developed a methodical pattern to lure his victims, usually children living on the streets or in extreme poverty. Prolonged period of activity. He operated for approximately 7 years, 1992 to 1999, without being captured, taking advantage of mobility between different regions and the vulnerability of his victims. The case. Garavito directed his attacks at boys between 6 and 16 years old, usually street children, rural workers, or extremely poor children. He presented himself as various personas: a street vendor, a monk, an NGO representative, or a job recruiter, to gain the children's trust. After luring his victims with promises of money, food, or work, he would take them to isolated areas where he would torture them, sexually abuse them, and finally murder them, usually by decapitation. Garavito kept records of his victims and often marked the location with specific symbols. He was finally captured in April 1999, after an investigation that connected a series of murders with similar characteristics in different regions of Colombia. Trial and sentence. Due to the Colombian legal system at the time, despite the enormity of his crimes, Garavito received a sentence of only 40 years, which was later reduced to 22 years in exchange for his cooperation and confession. This sentence caused public outrage and led to changes in Colombian laws for crimes against children. Technically, Garavito could be eligible for parole due to his behavior in prison and the time already served. However, he still faces charges in other countries, such as Ecuador, and Colombian authorities have worked to ensure that he remains imprisoned. The case of Luis Garavito exposed serious flaws in the child protection system and the judicial system of Colombia. It led to significant reforms in child protection laws and the country's penal code, as well as greater awareness of the vulnerability of children in situations of poverty. His case remains one of the most disturbing in modern criminal history, not only for the frightening number of victims, but also for the systematic cruelty of his crimes and the deliberate exploitation of the most vulnerable children in society. Harold Shipman, the Death Doctor. Harold Frederick Shipman, 1946 to 2004, was a British doctor and one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Known as Dr. Death, Shipman differs from other serial killers in that he used his trusted position as a doctor to commit his crimes, mainly against elderly patients. Number of victims. Officially proven victims. Shipman was formally convicted of 15 murders at his trial in 2000. Victims recognized in subsequent investigation. An official investigation conducted after his conviction concluded that he had murdered at least 218 patients, and possibly as many as 250. Possible victims. Some investigators estimate that the real number could reach around 400 people, although it is impossible to determine precisely due to the cremation of many bodies and the long period of his crimes. Harold Shipman is among the serial killers with the highest number of victims in the world for the following reasons. Confirmed number of victims. With more than 200 deaths attributed to him by an official investigation, he is considered the most prolific serial killer in modern British history and one of the largest in the world. Position of trust. As a respected doctor in the community, he had easy access to vulnerable victims and was able to kill for decades without raising suspicion. Systematic method. He developed a system for falsifying medical records, death certificates, and even wills of his victims. Long period of activity. It is believed that he murdered patients for more than 20 years, from 1975 to 1998. The case. Shipman began his career as a family doctor in 1974. His crimes came to light in 1998 when a local funeral home noticed an unusual pattern of deaths among Shipman's elderly patients, particularly women. What caught their attention was the fact that many victims were found sitting dressed and groomed, instead of in bed, as would be expected for sick people. The investigation revealed that Shipman injected lethal doses of diamorphine, heroin, into his patients, usually during home visits. He then falsified medical records to suggest that the victims were in poor health and forged death certificates. Interestingly, Shipman was also caught altering the will of one of his victims, Kathleen Grundy, 81, which ultimately led to his capture in 1998. The forged will left £386,000 to Shipman. Trial and end. In January 2000, Shipman was found guilty of 15 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. He never confessed his crimes and hanged himself in his cell in 2004, at the age of 57, apparently to ensure that his wife would receive his pension benefits. The case of Harold Shipman led to significant changes in British medicine and death monitoring systems. A public inquiry, the Shipman Inquiry, was established, resulting in reforms and regulations on opioid prescribing, death certification, and medical supervision. What makes Shipman particularly disturbing is that, unlike many serial killers who show obvious signs of disturbance, he maintained an appearance of respectability and professional competence. His motives were never fully understood, although the investigation suggested that he may have developed an obsession with death after witnessing his mother's death from cancer when he was young. The Shipman case remains one of the most shocking examples of abuse of professional trust in the history of modern medicine.